The soil is black. In the Amazon basin, where the natural earth is thin, acidic, and famously hostile to farming, there are patches of ground so dark and fertile that people today dig them up and sell them by the truckload. Some of it runs 2 meters deep. Nothing in the forest made it. It is called terra preta, dark earth. Under a microscope it is full of charcoal, broken pottery, fish bones, the ordinary debris of ordinary kitchens. It did not form. It was built deliberately, layer by layer, by people who lived there long enough to leave 2 meters of themselves behind. These are not rare accidents. They appear along the rivers in hundreds of places, some covering areas the size of small towns, and they carry a quiet arithmetic. You do not accumulate 2 meters of enriched soil by accident. You do it by feeding a great many people for a very long time. For most of the modern era, we were taught something that flatly contradicts this. The Amazon, we were told, was a pristine wilderness, a green desert, sparsely inhabited by small bands of hunters who barely touched it. The soil was too poor for real agriculture. Nothing large had ever lived here, and that story was reasonable. It really is difficult to farm rainforest soil. Strip the canopy and it turns to brick within a few seasons. The first outsiders to travel these rivers in later centuries found exactly what the theory predicted. Thin populations, small clearings, forest in every direction. The evidence seemed to agree. I want to be fair to this view because most people who held it were not fools. They were looking at a real forest, reading real soil surveys, standing in real emptiness. The pristine Amazon was not a lie told to school children. It was a conclusion, drawn carefully from what was visible at the time. It made its way into textbooks, into environmental writing, into the very language we used, untouched, virgin forest, the lungs of the planet, as though the place had no history but its own biology. For a long time, almost no one had reason to look underneath the assumption. Why would they? But there was always one document that did not fit. In 1542, a Spanish expedition led by Francisco de Orellana became the first Europeans to travel the length of the Amazon. A friar named Gaspar de Carvajal kept the chronicle, and what he wrote does not describe a green desert at all. Carvajal described the banks as populated almost continuously, villages running one into the next for miles, roads leading inland, fields under cultivation, so many people the expedition often could not safely stop to rest. He wrote of towns that stretched for leagues, of land white with crops. He wrote of a country that was full. For nearly 400 years, this chronicle was treated as an embarrassment, a liar's account, or a frightened man's exaggeration, or a bid to make the expedition sound grander than it was. It described something that could not exist. The soil forbade it, and so the document was quietly set aside. Then the dark earth started speaking. As archaeologists mapped the terra preta, as they found raised fields and causeways, and eventually whole earthwork complexes hidden beneath the canopy, Carvajal's impossible country began to look less like a lie and more like a memory. He had described what was there. We had refused to believe him. Sit with that for a moment. A first-hand account of a densely inhabited, cultivated Amazon existed in print, in libraries, in plain view, for 4 centuries, and the reflex of educated people was not to test it, but to explain it away. The evidence was never missing, only the willingness to read it. Now I owe you the honest counter-argument because it is a strong one. Carvajal was not a neutral witness. Expedition chronicles routinely inflated their dangers. A friar had every reason to make the river sound like a kingdom worth returning to. Skepticism of one dramatic source is not a conspiracy, it is method. And yet the soil is not a witness. The soil has no motive. The terra preta does not exaggerate to impress a Spanish court. It simply sits there 2 meters deep, carrying the chemical signature of centuries of settlement. When the document and the ground finally agree, you have to ask which one you were really doubting. Once you start looking at the ground, the pattern does not stay in one chronicle. It is written into the forest itself. Ecologists studying the composition of the Amazon have found that the trees are not distributed the way a wild forest would be. The useful ones, the ones people eat, are everywhere. Species that feed people, Brazil nut, cacao, palms, and dozens more, turn out to be dramatically overrepresented, clustering near old settlement sites, far more common than chance would allow. One large study found that domesticated species dominate the canopy across the basin. The forest, in other words, is a garden that went feral. Then there are the shapes in the earth. As cattle ranching stripped sections of forest in recent decades, something appeared beneath where the trees had stood. Geometric ditches, perfect circles and squares hundreds of meters across, geoglyphs carved into the ground by people who had cleared and shaped this land long before it was ever pristine. Farther south, in the Bolivian lowlands, the land is laced with raised agricultural fields, canals and causeways running arrow straight between settlement mounds, an engineered landscape built to farm a floodplain. None of this fits a picture of scattered bands barely touching the wilderness. All of it had been there, under the surface, waiting. In recent years, aircraft firing laser pulses down through the canopy have mapped what the eye could never see from the ground: the outlines of settlements, plazas, and connecting roads laid out with evident planning. Places long dismissed as untouched jungle turn out to hold the floor plan of something that was, unmistakably, a built environment. And here is what unsettles me most. This is not only an Amazon story. Turn to the other side of the hemisphere, to California and the ethnobotanist M. Kat Anderson spent years documenting how the landscape the settlers called untouched wilderness had in fact been tended, burned and cultivated for millennia. The oak woodlands, the wildflower fields, the clean and open forests that so enchanted the first arrivals, many of them were not accidents of nature. They were the product of deliberate burning and management, a continent-scale gardening so subtle that newcomers mistook the garden for the wild and congratulated God on the view. The same shape appears in the eastern forests, where the chestnut once fed both people and animals across enormous ranges, in woodlands thinned and shaped by regular fire. Again and again in places that never spoke to one another, the story is identical: a managed, productive landscape, read by later arrivals as empty nature. What strikes me is how the misreading always ran the same direction. Not once did the newcomers look at genuinely wild land and imagine a garden. The error was always the reverse: to look at a garden and see wilderness. A mistake that consistent stops behaving like a mistake and starts behaving like a need. Do you feel the accumulation? Not one anomaly, but many, scattered across 2 continents, each small on its own. A strange soil here, a dismissed chronicle there, an overfed forest, a burned woodland, a geoglyph under a pasture. Any single one is explainable. It is their sameness that becomes difficult to hold. Before I go further, I have to stop and give the strongest counter-argument its full weight, because it very nearly closes the case on its own. When the later explorers found emptiness, the emptiness was real. They were not lying. They walked into a land that had, in fact, just been catastrophically depopulated. In the century after 1492, disease moved through the Americas faster than any army. Smallpox, measles, influenza, running ahead of the Europeans themselves. In many regions, the population collapse is estimated at around 90%. Whole nations were gone within 2 or 3 generations, often before any outsider arrived to count them. So the man traveling the Amazon in later centuries genuinely saw a thin, quiet forest. One recent study argues the die-off was so vast that farmland reverting to forest pulled measurable carbon out of the atmosphere deep enough to nudge the global climate. The emptiness was not imagined, it was fresh, and this is where I have to be very careful with you, because it would be easy to overreach. The forests that once fed the world were not in the main destroyed by a single act of sabotage. They were emptied by a pandemic no one planned, no one intended, and no one at the time could have stopped. But notice what that explains and what it does not. It explains the silence Carvajal's successors walked into. It does not explain why, for 4 centuries after, with his chronicle in print and the dark earth underfoot, the people who studied this land kept insisting it had always been empty. The dying was an event, the forgetting was something else. So here is the problem I cannot set down. Not who killed the food forests, a virus did much of that, but who kept them buried afterward. And when I look at how uniform the burial was, across time and language and rival nations, the coordination it would have required starts to seem impossible. Think about who told this story. Portuguese and Spanish chroniclers, later English and French naturalists, geographers, soil scientists, ecologists, textbook authors, campaigners, institutions that competed, distrusted, and openly contradicted one another on nearly everything else. On this one point, that the land was pristine, they were, for centuries, in near perfect agreement. No single architect could have arranged that. There is no memo, no meeting, no hidden hand ordering the world's scholars to forget in unison. The geographer William Denevan gave the belief its name in 1992, the pristine myth, but naming a thing is not the same as finding whoever authored it, because no one did. And yet the myth served everyone who held it. If the land was empty, it was free to take. Vacant wilderness needs no treaty, no prior owner to displace, no conquest to excuse. A continent with no history before your arrival is one that was always conveniently waiting for you. The story was not merely believed, it paid. That, I think, is the closest thing to an answer I can offer, and it is stranger than a conspiracy. No one had to coordinate the silence, because the silence coordinated itself. Everyone who inherited the empty land story also inherited a reason to keep it. The convenience did the organizing that no committee ever could. But you should push back on me here, and I will push back on myself. Isn't this just how science works? Slowly, conservatively, correcting itself only when the evidence finally forces the issue. Paradigms shift late. Old ideas cling. Perhaps there is no mystery in this at all, only the ordinary friction of human knowledge. I have sat with that explanation longer than any other, because it is the one I would prefer to be true. It is clean. It requires nobody to have looked away on purpose. And for a great many scientific errors, it is exactly right. The world really does update slowly and reluctantly, but slow correction assumes the evidence was hard to reach. That is what does not hold here. Carvajal was never lost. The dark earth was never hidden. People farmed it, prized it, wondered aloud where it came from. The geoglyphs were not deep. They sat a few feet beneath trees anyone could have cleared. This was not a case of missing data slowly accumulating until the truth became undeniable. It was a case of available data being explained away, decade after decade, by people who had every technical means to test it and did not. That is not the friction of discovery. That is the momentum of a story no one wanted to disturb. I have tried, honestly, to find the moment someone decided this. A policy, a suppression, a burned archive, a name I could hand you. There isn't one. And that absence is the most disturbing part of all, because it means the erasure required no villain. It only required that no one ever find it worth their while to remember. And notice how gently it all resolved once it finally cracked. There was no scandal, no reckoning, no accounting for the 4 centuries of insistence. The textbooks simply quietly changed. Pristine became managed. The empty Amazon became the built one. And almost no one asked why we had been so certain for so long of the opposite. Consider the scale of what that quiet forgetting covered over. Not a village, not a valley. Estimates for the pre-contact Americas range widely, but many run into the tens of millions of people, whole civilizations of farmers and foresters and earth builders, an entire hemisphere of human work, filed under nature. These were not marginal people scraping at the edges of a wilderness. They were, by the evidence in the ground, among the great agricultural societies of the human past, shaping soil, breeding trees, engineering floodplains, feeding populations that rivaled the cities of their era. And we spent 400 years calling their fields untouched. So when the question is put plainly, who destroyed the ancient food forests that once fed the world, I find the honest answer splits in two, and the second half is the one that keeps me up. A pandemic destroyed the gardeners, but something else destroyed the memory that the gardens had ever existed, and the terra preta is still there. That is the detail I cannot get past. It did not wash away with the people who made it. In many places it renews itself, deepening slowly, a living soil that outlived its makers by 500 years, and quietly kept their record while we insisted there was none. We had it backwards the whole time. We thought we were looking at wilderness that human beings had never spoiled. We were actually looking at the overgrown ruin of one of the largest food systems our species ever built. A garden so old and so abandoned that we mistook its afterlife for its origin. Here is the counter-argument one last time, because I promised to keep giving it to you. Maybe none of this needed anyone's intention. Maybe convenience and inertia and honest error are enough, with no one ever choosing to look away. Maybe the pattern is real and the meaning I feel beneath it is only my own hunger for one. I hold that possibility open. I have to. But then I set it beside the plain fact that the evidence was never hidden, only unwelcome, and that the story we told instead happened every single time to be the story that justified taking the land. And that coincidence is the thing I cannot make small, because if we could do this once, if a whole civilization of forests and fields and earthworks could sit in plain sight, documented, farmable, walkable, and still be erased from the record of the world for 4 centuries simply because a more useful story existed, then the question stops being about the Amazon. The question becomes how much else we are standing on top of and calling empty. How many other places we have named wild because inhabited would have cost us something. How much of what we take for untouched nature is actually a grave we have agreed, collectively, and without ever once discussing it, not to read. I don't have the bottom of this. I want to be clear about that. I can show you the black soil, and the dismissed friar, and the gardens gone feral. And I can show you how neatly the forgetting served the ones who did the forgetting. I cannot show you the last room, but I can show you the door. It stands in the middle of the forest, exactly where the maps promised there was nothing, a dark seam of made earth, 2 meters deep, still carrying the work of the people we agreed had never lived here, and I have not yet found the bottom of it.